This book was written in about, this and the other epistles of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, they're written in about the year 90 AD, somewhere between 90 and 95, right towards the end of the 1st century. Jesus ascended back up into glory in 33, and since then the church had been being built, the gospel was going out, churches were being planted, thousands were being saved, apostles were dying. John, when he writes this, he's the last apostle left. In the last 60 years, he's seen his close friends, his brother, the remaining of the apostles, and no doubt thousands of other Christians have all perished at the sword as they go and preach to Gentile nations, or they're killed by being thrown off the temple, or skinned alive, or speared, whatever it was. Christians and the apostles, as their leaders were being hunted down, they were being killed. John alone is left. And this, 2nd John, is his last letter that we have recorded to a Christian church. He's going to write 3rd John, maybe very soon after this, but 3rd John is to a single person, a guy named Gaius. And 1st John was to a whole group of churches, but this one, as it starts out, to an elect lady. He's sort of using that as a metaphor of one woman, one church, and all her children, the people who go to that church. So this is his last letter to people on earth, to a church setting, and what he says is so important. It carries emphasis. It's his last letter to a church, and he has warned. He has spoken of, as that we looked at in the first 4 verses in the first week. We saw that he emphasizes truth. He has to start there because truth is what was getting thrown around and thrown to the side and neglected in his day. So he had to emphasize the importance of and the basis of truth in everything. And then he talked about the importance and the necessity and the Christian fundamental virtue of love in a church. That if we're a church that is all about truth but neglecting love, then we're not walking according to God's commandments. And if we're trying to obey God but doing it without love, we have lost ourselves. We are a clanging cymbal. But this evening, we come to the section that must have hurt John to write. Probably a part that he regretted having to write about. He loves to emphasize truth and he loves to command people to walk in love, but now he has to tell them the ugly nature of the fact that there are false teachers, deceivers going around in the Christian world. We all love to be positive. We all love the positive parts of Scripture and those that talk about the importance of truth. That's good. The importance of love, we like that. But this world is not all fine and dandy, and in the Christian life and into the future of the kingdom, no less so. The kingdom is, as Jesus says in his parables over and over again, it's like a field of wheat growing, but there are also weeds all through it. It is like a flock of sheep, but there are false goats all throughout it. That as long as the church exists, as long as the true Christianity exists, there will also be false forms of Christianity. As long as there are true teachers, there will be false teachers. As long as there is the true apostolic word from God, there will also be false apostolic words from God to confuse. And so he writes this section tonight from verse 7 onwards towards the end, warning of how, as Christians, we should treat those people, how we should relate to them and think about them. And so I remind you of the context, that in John's day, in that period, the heresy was starting up, which became in the 2nd and 3rd century known as Gnosticism. But back then it was sort of still in its germinal form, so it was just it was a bit more messy, and we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that means in a bit. But in his day, these false teachers had come to the churches that John loved and was teaching and preaching among. Church history tells us that John spent most of his time in and around Ephesus in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey today. That's where, in his old age, he did most of his preaching. And false teachers and preachers had come in and led a whole bunch of people astray to believe things that were against the essential, fundamental truth of Christianity. And there had been a large exodus of people who had left those churches to follow these other teachers. It is as if we can tell from John's language that the people of the churches who were remaining faithful to truth rose up and stood firm on what was necessary, and those others were forced to leave. And so John is the loving apostle who cares about truth and the health of God's church. As the shepherd that loves the flock, he writes to them. And he shares in their pain. And he understands what they're going through, but he reiterates the importance and the necessity and the godliness of what they have just done. It was necessary. It was important for the sake of the church and God's glory and the gospel.